following program is a presentation of the 1989 Tennessee Williams New Orleans Literary Festival. The festival is funded under a grant from the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. The festival is also supported by a City of New Orleans Municipal Endowment Grant for the Arts from annual payments stipulated in the franchise agreement of Cox Cable New Orleans and administered by the Arts Council of New Orleans. Also helping to make the festival possible is the David M. Metzner Foundation for the Arts and the Greater New Orleans Foundation. Hello, I'm Peggy Scott Laborde. The following are highlights from an interview with New Orleans-born novelist Anne Rice, best known for her Vampire Chronicles. This is a presentation of the 1989 Tennessee Williams New Orleans Literary Festival, held at Le Petit Theater in the French Quarter. Moderator for this discussion is University of New Orleans English professor Dr. Kenneth Holditch. And now, an interview with Anne Rice.
Since this is a New Orleans Literary Festival, let's start out, and since you're the premier New Orleans writer in the public eye at the moment, let's talk a little bit about the influence of New Orleans on your work and your feelings about the city.
Well, you know, my characters either start out in New Orleans or they end up in New Orleans, and every book I've written, except for Cry to Heaven, was pretty much infused with a longing for New Orleans. A few years ago when I was here for promoting Feast of All Saints, I remember I met you and you said to me at the time that maybe it wasn't a tragedy that I had to leave New Orleans and go away, because sometimes people who are away from the city write more about it than people who are here. And perhaps you were right, because during my exile in California, 25 years or so, I would have dreams about New Orleans. I was obsessed with it, and I think a great deal of the longing and a great deal of the missing of New Orleans went into making the chapters of my books about New Orleans particularly vivid for me. I could sit there at the keyboard and I could go home, basically. And it was never a conscious decision. I didn't start out thinking, well, I'm going to invoke the city where I want to be. I would just begin writing, and pretty soon the intensity would come as I moved into that setting. And it always felt, I always felt more alive and less isolated when I was writing about New Orleans.
You told me that you were particularly interested in the neighborhoods, the differences between the various neighborhoods, and that as a child you remembered the Irish Channel, the Garden District, and the...
Well, that's true. I grew up uptown on Philip and St. Charles, and one of the great mysteries to me later in life, when I was out in California and I would look back on my childhood, one of the mysteries to me was the dramatic contrast between the Irish Channel and the Garden District. And both neighborhoods were very much part of my life. I would get up every day and walk through the Garden District to go to school at St. Alphonsus School, which was in the Irish Channel. And many of my relatives lived in the Irish Channel, and my grandparents had come from there. One of my grandfathers was a dock worker in the unions on the waterfront. Another one had worked for the railroads on the waterfront. And I was always struck by this dramatic contrast, that you would pass through this almost unreal neighborhood of Greek Revival houses and oak trees and beautiful cast iron fences and ever-blooming azaleas, it seemed. And then you would emerge into the streets of the Irish Channel without trees, with the sun beating down, and yet there was a very wonderful kind of architecture there too. There were the shotgun houses with their gingerbread eaves, and then I would enter St. Alphonsus Church or St. Mary's Church, these two marvelous churches that I think have been somewhat neglected here by the tourists and really ought to be shown. But in any event, in my childhood, I would go every morning to Mass in one or the other. And so we'd walk down this narrow, treeless street open the doors of St. Alphonsus Church and step into this almost fantasy world of Romanesque architecture and murals and stained glass. And this had a profound effect. This was the day-to-day texture of my life. Later, when I began to think about it, it seemed fantastic. I couldn't quite understand it. I thought, well, for one thing, why were there two churches side by side? A magnificent Gothic German church, a magnificent Irish church right across the street. What was all that about? And it was out in California when I was trying to figure out that landscape that I really began my research into the history of Louisiana. And I discovered the free people of color, I discovered the Creole history. I also discovered a lot about the Irish, which I haven't yet used in my work. But trying to capture that, trying to get what reality was like every day for me was very hard as a young writer. And it wasn't until, strangely enough, that I wrote Interview with the Vampire, and I was actually supposedly looking at the world through the eyes of a vampire, that I was able to touch the reality of the strange texture and glamour of New Orleans. You know, when I would try to write about it in a realistic contemporary novel, it would sound unbelievable. I mean, people would say, well, why do you write about these big houses and these oak trees and everything? I mean, nothing like that really exists. That's fantasy, you know. I thought those are the streets I walked through as a child. But in any event, it was the vampire that finally helped me to capture some of that. And then after that, I had the confidence to write The Feast of All Saints about the free people of color who settled in the French Quarter. And I was able to move into their world.
Let's talk a little bit about that, because I think that's one of your novels that has not been read as much as it should, although certainly your followers have read everything you've written, many of them. But let's talk about The Feast of All Saints, which is a favorite of mine, and about how you came to be interested in those people and write about them.
Well, I was going through that period of personal research that I mentioned. I've been in California a few years, and I was going to the library and looking up books on New Orleans, and I happened on a wonderful description of the quadroon and mulatto community that existed here before the Civil War, and I happened on the fact that it was free men of color who published the first literary magazine ever printed in Louisiana. It was called Les Sennelles, and I think only 3 issues of it exist today. And I thought, how incredibly romantic, you know, that these quadroons and octoroons put out the first magazine. You hear a lot about the quadroons who danced at the quadroon balls and became the mistresses of white planters. But here was this group of people who put out this literary magazine that cared passionately about having their poetry published. And all of it was in French. It was very much a French colonial type of thing that they were doing. But it was also their own. It was the essence of the word Creole, meaning people of French or Spanish descent who were born here. And I knew instantly I had to write about these people. I had to write about them because there was the potential there for tragedy. They were in the midst of life, and yet they were completely shut out of it by laws that they weren't allowed to, you know, there was segregation on all different levels. They weren't allowed to go into professions. They weren't allowed to vote. They weren't allowed to do many things, and yet they had attained a great deal of wealth and prestige. There were playwrights, there were artists, there were painters, there were sculptors. The cemeteries here had beautiful funereal sculpture that was done by free men of color. And there were many women who were prominent in the community too. And probably anybody who grows up here knows Julia Street was named for a free woman of color. They left their imprint on all different aspects of the city, and yet nothing was really known about them. And I didn't realize then that the theme of almost everything I write was going to be the plight of the outsider, particularly the outsider living in the midst of things. But they fit that description exactly, because not only were they in the midst of things, in the middle of New Orleans life, they had about them a glamour and an allure. The white planters did go after the quadroons and octoroons, and they were much sought after for their professional knowledge in many capacities. They were good craftsmen. There were famous makers of stairways. There was even a famous fencing master, Basile Croquer, I think is how you pronounce it. But in any event, what I had to do was years of research before they became so alive to me and so familiar to me that I could walk down the street feeling that I was one of them. And Feast of All Saints, I think, took more research and more work than any novel I ever did. It has never been as popular as my other books. and yet there are always people who will come up to me and say, the book I really liked was Feast of All Saints. So that always makes me feel particularly good.
Well, you're working on yet another New Orleans novel now.
Yes, I'm working on two. The Witching Hour, which is a supernatural novel about a family that inherits a witching power in every generation, a psychic power to communicate with spirits. And that novel is set in New Orleans and in the Garden District, and it's set both now in the present and in the past. I was working on that before I came back. I had broken off work on it to do The Queen of the Damned, the third novel in the Vampire Chronicles. And also because I had to come back to New Orleans before I could continue. There were just things I had to see and know about contemporary New Orleans. And strangely enough, the novel was set in an old crumbling Garden District house on Phillip Street. And I wound up coming back here and buying a house on Phillip Street, only a couple of blocks from where the novel is set. And now I've moved the setting. I'm buying another house on First Street, and I've already incorporated that house into the novel. But it's quite a wonderful experience to be immersed again in this atmosphere, to be really here while writing. I've never been here while writing about New Orleans before. I've come back and done research and taken photographs and walked around and then gone home. But this is the first time I've actually been able to write with the sound of the rain falling on the banana trees and the smell of the river breeze coming in the window, and it's really been wonderful.
Writing your humid prose, as the New York Times, as you told me, the New York Times calls it when they get angry with something you're writing.
Well, the New York Times isn't always kind to us Southern writers.
That's
they
true.
Find us florid and eccentric, and they really don't quite understand us. We don't write about marriages in Connecticut, and they just.
You have written under 3 different names, so you have, in a sense, 3 different persona. You are Anne Rice, of course, whom we all know and love. You are Anne Rampling. You are A.R. Roquelaure. A.N. Roquelaure. Mm-hmm. Would you like to comment on this split in your writing personality?
Well, the Anne Rampling books are both contemporary novels, and they are heavily set in New Orleans. There's quite a bit of each one. Exit to Eden and Belinda are both set here. And I think that voice evolved, the voice of Anne Rampling, because the voice of Anne Rice that developed for me in the vampire novels and in Feast of All Saints and Cry to Heaven was really a European-American voice. It was the voice of the writer who, as a little girl, had read Great Expectations and Jane Eyre, and the American authors who were heavily European influenced, like Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville. But there was another voice in me that wanted to be heard, and it was the voice that loved Hemingway and James M. Cain and Raymond Chandler and Ben Franklin, the sort of American voice. And I felt released by that pseudonym to kind of do things in a different style. But really, both Belinda and Exit to Eden are about outsiders again. It's the same theme, and about people who are struggling to achieve some kind of peace with the world in spite of the fact that they are outcasts. Exit to Eden's been called Pornography, Plain and Simple by Publishers Weekly, and I was offended by the plain and simple, but not. And now the A.N. Roquelaure books are pornography outright, and I'm very proud that I wrote them. I wrote the pornography that I never could find in the bookstores, and it's there for anyone who wants to read it. It's not everyone's cup of tea, and I think if it's not your fantasy, it'll be pretty much of a bore. But I'm very proud that I was able to do that, and there have never been any bad consequences. I haven't been arrested, and nothing has gone wrong, so I don't know. Maybe nothing will.
I suppose probably a definition is in order. What is your definition of pornography?
Pornography is literature written to sexually arouse the reader. Okay. That's exactly what it is.
A pointed definition.
And I think it's completely legitimate to write that, just as it is to write any other kind of literature. I mean, sex is a major part of people's lives. It's, to my way of thinking, it's a tragedy that writers who can write have not written pornography, that we have very few examples in literary history of pure pornography where someone who knows how to write sits down and writes a book where they explore this side of the personality, this side of the imagination, really. There was a rumor for a while that Charles Dickens had written a famous erotic novel called My Secret Life by Walter X. Grove Press published this in the 60s, but I don't think Dickens did write that book. I don't know who did. The man certainly knew how to write, and it's an amazing document because it tells us about the psyche of the Victorian man in a completely uninhibited way. It's like the other side of the coin. If you take Dickens' novels as one side, this is the other. And, you know, I think we need more of that. You know, we're going into another age of repression. I mean, the 80s are, I mean, we're going through this again where we had the 60s and the 70s where for a little while we believed sex was a good thing, you know. But now we're going back to a kind of Puritanism, and we're hearing denunciations of people who speak out for the wholesomeness of sex. And I hate to see this happen, but it's the nature of American culture, I think, to go back and forth like this. I mean, you know, Tennessee Williams' work certainly got a lot of flack in the 50s. I think he always had an outstanding literary reputation, as well as the reputation of the shocking playwright, but you know, there were times, I think, when his works must have been censored and criticized. When I was growing up here as a Catholic girl, Tennessee Williams was not a dirty word exactly, but it was somebody we weren't really supposed to go to the movies based on his books.
Yeah.
You know, that kind of thing.
Are you conscious as you move from one personality to another of a different voice?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a way when I'm writing as Anne Rice that I really am hearing those voices of the Brontes and Dickens and so forth. I'm trying to achieve a vocabulary. Say you could take Interview with the Vampire, you could take Feast of All Saints, you could give those books to somebody in another country, and that person wouldn't really know that an American wrote those books necessarily. He could think that perhaps an English writer wrote them, or that even they were French novels in translation. It wouldn't be clear. But when I'm writing as Anne Rampling, I'm aiming for spoken speech, the cadences and sentences that are very nearly like what you would speak aloud. I'm trying very hard to get that. And to me, that's actually quite an artistic challenge. I've been a little sad to see that some of the reviews seem to take it for granted that the Anne Rampling books are intended to be lighter or lesser. That nothing could be farther from the truth. I think it's a great challenge to write a novel that sounds like spoken speech. And I certainly use many more colloquial and vernacular words than I would in the Anne Rice.
Do you know any particular writer, other than ones you've mentioned, who influenced the style itself?
Well, I think I always have gone for very florid and very alliterative authors. I loved Nabokov's Lolita. I read Eudora Welty all the time, really just to luxuriate in her language. I mean, I just love it. I love The Sound and the Fury by Faulkner for that same reason. I do read poetry. I've read a great deal of my husband Stan's poetry. I've heard it read aloud, and a lot of the cadences have sort of gotten into my head. And W.B. Yeats is another favorite poet that I read frequently, just to hear the language. San Francisco had, for many years, and still does, a very active poetry community, and they give a lot of public readings there. And I used to go quite often with Stan and sometimes alone. So I heard a great deal of poetry read aloud. And this to me was, you know, a very wonderful kind of nourishing thing. But really when it comes to, when I sit down at the typewriter and I begin to write, what influences me the most in that regard, I think, is something that's almost innate in an Irish American. You know, when you grow up in Irish Catholic families the way I did, especially in New Orleans, you hear great storytellers. You hear them all around you, aunts, uncles, grandparents. They know how to tell a story. They know how to dramatize the simplest event that they're reporting to you. And I heard people like that from the time I was born. You know, I would hear them at funerals, I'd hear them at wakes, I can hear them now. I go to dinner at their houses and they'll begin to tell a story about something that happened in the past. And I marvel at their timing and the way that they can make these events come to life. So all of that is there. You know, I think Playboy a few years back actually did some sort of satirical little test about if you had this influence and that influence, scored 10 points to it being a writer. And I remember they said if you're Irish on both sides, 20 points, you know. going to have this madness and this excess, and I think that's true.
I know you said you had changed from the earlier period. First of all, I think most people would be interested in hearing how you came to begin writing Interview with the Vampire.
Well, Interview with the Vampire was the most haphazard, accidentally written book. It really was. I had done a short story called Interview with the Vampire, and it was done in a completely instinctive, spontaneous way. I didn't know. I sat down at the typewriter. I wanted to get a short story done by midnight, and I began to write. And I just had this single idea, really. What would it be like if you could get a vampire to tell you the real truth about what it was like to be immortal? And more significantly, what if he would tell you the real truth about what it was like to take life as nourishment, you know, to take someone else's life? It seemed to me that nothing I'd read or seen in the movies had ever really gotten to the metaphorical wellspring there. And by midnight I had finished the story. It was 30 pages long, and it was quasi-comic. And no, not really comic, but it was a little bit on the ironic side. The vampire sounded a little too much like Oscar Wilde. And I took it out over the years, and I would rewrite it with a view to doing something with it. I never do anything with it. I think I knew instinctively for many years that I must not do anything in terms of publishing. I would just work in the back room. I'd take the story out, work on other things, and put them away. Anyway, I took it out finally, I think around 1972 or 3, and I began to work on it to get it ready for a short story contest. And it began to grow into the novel. The character of the vampire suddenly got a name, and the name was Lewis. And one of those things happens that can happen with writing that makes it worthwhile. I suddenly ceased being the interviewer in that story, and I became the vampire. And suddenly I was that character, and that character was talking about how his brother had died, and he was talking about Louisiana, he was talking about New Orleans, he was talking about grief and about the past. And at that point, that's when I was able as a writer to touch those contrasts and textures that I talked about before. I was able to talk about the glamour and the gloom of my childhood. And there was that feeling of being alive in a way that I'd never been alive before, and I just went with it. I just wrote, you know, day in and day out for about 5 weeks, and then there was the novel Interview with the Vampire, the first draft of it. And I finished it about 4 o'clock in the morning, I think, either in late December or early January. And I knew then that it was going to be my first published work. I wrote this in my diary, and sat in the living room from about 4 to 5 a.m. and then went back in and started revising it till about, and wrote another 40 pages or something, you know, till 7 o'clock or so, I don't even know. I'm one of the fastest typists in the world, thank God. But in any event, it was about 9 months later that it was accepted for publication, and I then greatly enlarged it and changed the ending to a much more tragic ending. It hadn't really ended in that first draft. And there was, again, a very intense writing period. I did not know what I was going to do with it. I just knew that it was going to be a different ending. And it was in the second ending, really, that Claudia, the child vampire in the book, perished. In the earlier book, she had been saved. But it was absolutely necessary that she be destroyed. It was necessary for me psychologically, and it was necessary to the novel. And that was quite an ordeal for me. I finished it like in a shuddering kind of state. But it was just a totally instinctive, spontaneous creation. I had no idea from one day to the next what was going to happen to those characters. They would walk out the door, and I didn't know where they were going to go. There was one point where I threw out about 50 pages because Claudia's voice was wrong. She is the child vampire in the novel. Lestat and Louis, the older, the male vampires create her. It's really Lestat's doing, who is sort of the villain of the book, and doesn't become a hero till the vampire Lestat. But they make her, and she's doomed from the beginning because she's a woman in a child's body. But I didn't think, you know, when it first happened, I didn't know that that's where it was going to go. I began to write, and I thought, well, of course, she's not going to grow. You know, she's mentally going to grow, but her body is not going to grow. Now, later, of course, when people said, well, does this have anything to do with the fact that you yourself have just had a 5-year-old child die of leukemia? I said, well, I guess it does, but I hadn't actually thought of that when I was writing it. If I'd thought of it, I would have been blocked. I couldn't have done it, you know. But I was just writing away, and all of this, that novel is really in some ways totally autobiographical, but it's only in the most strange, removed ways. But I think that one of the reasons that I succeeded in finishing it was that I didn't know what it was about. In terms of me personally, I certainly knew what it was about in terms of itself, that it was about grief and about guilt and about seeking for salvation, even though one is, in the eyes of the world and in one's own eyes, a total outcast. I knew that, but I didn't really know what it had to do with me. And to me, that novel remains a very dark, tangled kind of I don't know how to, almost nightmarish novel. You know, it's, I mean, I'm always intrigued by things people say in response to it, because I don't know whether I would read it myself. You know, I don't really know.
Do you go back and read any of your work?
I can't stand to read it. I mean, I can't stand to read it the day after it's in print.
Well, I think
you know,
that's true of most writers.
It's just agonizing.
Is it fear of finding it not quite so good as you felt it was when you were writing it, or is it just that you feel you've moved beyond that?
I don't know. I think there's an aversion that builds up because of the intense involvement with it while you're writing it. And then when you're finished, maybe I would want to change it. Yeah. You know, I open the interview with the vampire and I read sentences in there and I really wish I could rewrite them, you know. Yeah. But I know that it's probably better not to do that. That what would I be doing? I'd be tampering with something that was done 15 years ago, you know, that by a different person. And it would be foolish to do that. But there are things about that book that irk me, you know. Its excess irks me, but at the same time, that's the only way I know how to do anything, is excessively, and go all the way out on the limb, you know, and do something that others can ridicule. They want.
Are you conscious of the vampire novels becoming more philosophical as you've moved through the Vampire Lestat and the Queen of the Damned? The Queen of the Damned seems considerably more philosophical and more even political.
Well, I think Queen of the Damned is more philosophical. And it certainly was for me. It was, but there's a way in which all this writing is always deeply psychological. It was a considerable length after Queen of the Damned was written that I realized what it was about psychologically. I still don't feel entirely comfortable talking about it, but it has something to do with my mother and my daughter again. And these two, my mother died when I was 15, right at the time I left New Orleans, and my daughter died later when she was almost 6 years old, and there's something about the two figures of Claudia and Akasha in the book, Akasha, the mother of the vampires, that's directly related to me in my life. And the fact that these two people tried to destroy Lestat, my hero, who is in a sense involved with both, it's very personal. Yeah. And again, I'm glad that I didn't analyze it. I'll only see it as the years pass, but yes, I have been conscious of the Queen of the Damned being more philosophical.
We talked at one time about your use of Stan Rice, your husband's poetry in Queen of the Damned, and I thought what you said about that was very interesting, how it came about that you used his very fine poems.
Yeah. I was looking for one poem of his that I remembered. It was in an unpublished manuscript, and I went back through the manuscripts and the books to look for that poem, and I began to see all different poems in there that were directly related to what I was doing. And I asked him if I could use these, and he said fine. He wasn't too happy about segments of his poems being taken out of context, but since it was me, he said it was all right. So sort of persuaded him. But in any event, I wound up using a great deal of it in the book because I felt that these were poems that had influenced me for years. And I had heard them read aloud at readings, and I had read them in his books, and I was amazed that he was dealing with so many of the same ideas, and I hadn't been conscious of it. And many of the chapters in The Queen of the Damned were actually written before I selected those poems, and those poems were written years before The Queen of the Damned, and yet they deal with the same images and the same ideas. And I feel that they form some sort of a coherent whole in the book. You know, they aren't something tacked on. They are really part of what the book is about.
Yes, well, they're very integral to the book. You are at work, or at least planning, a fourth vampire chronicle.
Yes. I'm writing a fourth one called The Body Thief, and it's an adventure of my hero Lestat. Lestat, as I mentioned before, was really the villain of Interview with the Vampire, and it wasn't until I got to writing The Vampire Lestat that he sort of became my hero. and the embodiment of many things that concern me morally. And he really now dominates the series for me. I mean, The Body Thief is his adventure. Lewis, the main character of Interview with the Vampire, will also be a major character, though, in The Body Thief. And again, their dialogue will be there. That really never got off the ground in Interview. They argued, but they didn't really have a dialogue about the way to look at life and the way to live life. One thing I just want to say, that I don't know how many people in the audience aren't familiar with these books. I just want to say that if these books aren't about everything, then they fail. They're not just about vampires. They're not just about the supernatural. They really are about outcasts, outsiders, and about us. And if they don't do that, they fail. And so when I say that they have a dialogue, these two characters, about how to live life, that may sound preposterous when you're talking about two vampires that climb out of coffins every evening and go out to drink blood, but they really do talk about how to approach every experience that life has to offer, from violence to the simplest sensuous apprehension of the way the moonlight looks coming through a lace curtain. And Lestat's methods are totally 18th century, his approach. It's very aristocratic, it's very pre-Freudian, it's very much the approach of a man of action and a man who is fully aware of the moral scope of what he's doing or not doing. And Louis' vision was really a romantic, post-Byron, Freudian type of vision. You know, sort of, I mean, that's how I saw it. And these are both, you know, ways that I have of looking at life and ways that are at war in me,
Yeah.
you know.
You've always been interested in fantasy, in reading fantasy, and the fantasy writers you told me you liked are...
The writers that delight me are the English horror writers of the 19th century and the early 20th century. And two of them are actually Anglo-Irishmen. Algernon Blackwood is a writer that I would recommend to anyone for having written just some very almost flawless prose, supernatural stories, particularly the stories Secret Worship and Ancient Sorceries, beautiful stories. And another writer, Sheridan Le Fanu, who wrote one of the most beautiful vampire stories in English, a story called Carmilla. It's practically a novella. Many, many B-movies have been made based on Carmilla. You've probably seen late shows versions of these movies, because Carmilla was sort of a shocking novel in that there was a great deal of lesbianism in it. Vampires have always been associated, I think, with transcending gender and with being attracted to human beings of both sexes. And that was in Carmilla in the 1870s, and it, you know, it's always been tied in the theme. I didn't invent that, the idea that the vampires would transcend gender. But in any event, I highly recommend those. And of course, The Turn of the Screw by Henry James is another great inspiration, because I think Henry James demonstrated that there is no reason why we should be limited in the supernatural fiction realm. We can write, we can strive to write great literature.
Do you have plans to do any other Anne Rampling books?
I do. I have an Anne Rampling book right now that I want to do, but I don't know when I'm going to get to it. That's the thing. It's in my head and it grows, and there are times when I'm very conscious of it, but I honestly don't know what will happen with it.
Do you take a lot of notes and make outlines and so forth as you plan these books in advance?
I do. I work on a computer now, and I have for several years, and it's absolutely wonderful because it enables you to get past all the physical labor that the typewriter demands of you. That really slows you down and causes you to compromise with your work. I think the computer makes it so easy for you to revise that it like puts the maximum pressure on you to perfect what you're writing. And it also makes it very easy to take notes. And so I go to the computer all the time and I just have conversations, you know, and we'll write out notes. And I do have a lot of notes on stuff that I may never get to, you know. Because right now I'm in that very exciting position of having more novels out there that I can see and I can get to.
You plan the whole novel before you sit down now to write, or?
It isn't so much that I plan it, I see it. You know, I didn't see Interview with the Vampire. I had no idea what was going to happen with that book. But I saw The Vampire Lestat to some extent. I saw Feast of All Saints. I saw Cry to Heaven. And I see these, The Witching Hour and The Body Thief. I see the whole shape of the novel. Now, when I actually start to write it, all kinds of unexpected things will happen. There'll be developments that take me by surprise. You know, and they may set me back and depress me, you know, send me out walking around the Garden District. But it just, in the rain or something. But basically, I do have a vision of where it's going to go.
Do you write in sequence, or you wouldn't write the ending first?
No, I pretty much move right through it. And I pretty much write as if it's going to go out in the mail the next day. You know, if I can't get the chapter exactly right, I don't go on to the next one. I do it as if I was shooting this footage, and, you know, it had to be processed that night, and you couldn't go on with the movie till the next, I developed that early on because I found that as a struggling apprentice writer, if I didn't do that, I wound up with just a mess, you know, pile of pages that, with everything mixed up and marked up. So I learned to write as if it was finished copy, and actually write in finished copy.
Speaking of movies, there are plans in the work for filming The Vampire?
There are plans, but there have been plans for 12 years, so I gave up on them. At the moment, Warner Brothers has the option on Interview with the Vampire, Vampire Lestat, and Queen of the Damned. The producers working on it are Julia Phillips and Michael Levy, these two producers who for years have been trying to get this project done. David Geffen, who's a major wheel out there in Hollywood with Geffen Productions, is a big name in the record world and in the Broadway stage world. He's sort of become the creative executive in connection with Warner's that's doing it, and it's really astonishing how slowly things move. I wrote a script for it last year that was really full of compromises because it was written for these producers and it was to a large extent what they wanted. And I would argue one day for something else and write something else the following day, you know, that they wanted. But basically, all of that material, the books and the scripts, are now going to directors. And the director I want is Ridley Scott, but they won't listen to me. So I keep saying Ridley Scott is the only one who can do this right. You know, he did. But they are not listening. You know, they may eventually wind up to be Ridley Scott, but they just don't want to go to him at this point. The actor I want to play Lestat is Rutger Hauer, and they won't listen on that
either. You told me that you're working on a television series now.
Yes, I did. What I did was develop a concept for a series called Hello Darkness, and it's about a policeman who moves into a house that's haunted by a female ghost. But I have found in the last 2 years that I cannot work in the world of television. I cannot stand it. And so I'm trying to finish this concept. I'm typing up the concept, and I'll be mailing it out to them, and they'll get another screenwriter to actually write the episodes of this series. But I will have the opportunity to sort of oversee it and shape it. But I'm not going to set foot out of New Orleans for television.
All right, we're going to have questions from the audience, and I'll repeat the questions if you'll ask them so that we can clarify them.
I'd like to know why you chose Ridley Scott. Can you talk about that a little more? And also a little more why you don't want to work directly in television. That you'll mail him something, but you're not going to talk to him about it.
Okay, the question is why Ms. Rice has chosen Ridley Scott, or wants Ridley Scott, and the second question is why she does not wish to work directly with television.
Well, with regard to Ridley Scott, I felt that The Duelist and Blade Runner, those two movies were masterpieces that he did. I felt Alien was in its own way a masterpiece. It doesn't have the scope of a movie like Blade Runner, but Alien, the crafting of Alien is so fine that I don't know of any other movie that's got quite that attention to detail. I felt Someone to Watch Over Me was in its own way a sort of flawed masterpiece, a small masterpiece. I think he gets a texture that is exactly the right texture for the vampire films. If he can, because he's able to make the otherworldly seem real, and he's able to take the real and make it seem otherworldly. And he's got exactly the quality. The reason I don't want to work in television is that I don't respect anyone there. I went into the realm. Now I went to Hollywood feeling differently about TV. You know, I'm in some ways a real, I don't know what you call a populist. You know, I really believe in the people. And I believed in an art that can reach the people. I mean, that's why I love Dickens, because he, you know, could galvanize a whole country, and everybody read him from the simplest people to the most sophisticated. And I believe in that kind of art, and I really felt TV has this great potential to really do wonderful things. And I went down there and I dealt with the people in TV land, and they really are as stupid as everybody says they are. I mean, they're really fools. And I've had just I mean, you know, you have to, they want me to fly there to present a concept for this show, Hello Darkness, this TV show. It's now been bought by Fox Network, and it's going to be launched. But there was a time when we were presenting it to CBS and NBC and ABC. I had to fly there to present it. I said, why can't they read the treatment? It's down here. I'm a writer. It's written, you know. I said, no, you have to come to the office. Well, the reason you have to come to the office and sit there with these people is they are too stupid to read it. They sit there and they listen. Most of the time when the studios, even, and this is not TV, just motion pictures, when they buy books for motion pictures, they haven't read the books, they've read what's called the coverage. And the coverage is maybe 30 pages that somebody's typed up on it. And I heard, for example, that one reason Paramount didn't buy The Vampire Lestat, though it owned Interview, was that the coverage was so bad. So when it came time for Lorimar to buy the 3 vampire novels together, Julia and Mike told me to write the coverage. So I had to sit down there and write the synopsis of this stuff. And that's what sold it. You know, and I did write a synopsis of The Queen of the Damned, which wasn't finished yet, so they didn't have the opportunity to read that, but I'm sure that some of them never have. And these are people that are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars. They want you to come there and be in that room because the decision is basically something they want to make that day at 11 a.m. on the basis of feeling. And there's no more to it than that, and they really don't know anything about anything. And I had another experience with them that I'll briefly mention. I've done a book called The Mummy, which is coming out in 2 months. And this started as an idea for a miniseries. I was invited to do this. They said, do you have any ideas you'd like to do? These 2 producers came to me and said this. I wouldn't even go to Hollywood. They came up to San Francisco. We had lunch. All these people do is have lunch. So we went to lunch, and I said, yes, I have an idea for The Mummy. I would like to have this immortal wake up in the Edwardian era, come out of the coffin in typical B-movie mummy fashion, but then be unwrapped and be a very beautiful, brilliant person, you know. And that's my idea of The Mummy. And they said, great, we want to do it, we want to do it. I finally worked on this thing. I completed the whole thing, and basically presented it to these 2 gentlemen producers, and I've never had anything I've written treated in that way. They virtually tore it apart. There was nothing in it that they did not see as flexible and changeable. So I thought, okay, I wrote this for them, this is the way they feel. What I said was, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to take this now, and I'm going to go to my publisher, and I'm going to get a book deal for this very story with these characters doing these very things that I want them to do. And I did, and the book is coming out, and the publisher is very high on it, and now these 2 producers are going to make a mini-series of it. But there was a point there where on the phone, I mean, every single thing I did, they wanted to change. And I've done a lot of thinking about this experience, and I honestly believe that it's impossible to separate whatever there might have been in that manuscript that they could have criticized. It's hard to separate that from the fact that they approach virtually every manuscript in that fashion. And they treat writers like trash, and they have only trash writers as a consequence, because no one is going to go through an experience like that and stay there. I mean, it's not that, I'm not saying that what I handed them was perfect, there wasn't room for criticism, but the attitude was so cavalier and so casual, it respected virtually nothing. They see writers as people who come in to plaster a wall. There's no more respect than that. So that was the experience that really caused me to go away. I would not go there after that. And now they are launching this miniseries. CBS is doing it. They've gotten a scriptwriter named John Goldsmith from England to do the script, and they're all for it, and they're saying it's wonderful. And I have reminded them several times that the book that is being published is exactly the script I gave them that they tore apart. And they don't want to talk about that. You know, they say, oh, well, so you redid the beginning. I said, no, I didn't.
Okay.
You mentioned your admiration for a lot of the 19th century writers in the early 20th century. I was wondering what you thought of some of the contemporary supernatural and horror writers like Stephen King or Peter Straub or Clive Barker.
Let me repeat the question for the talk. The question is, what about some of the contemporary horror writers, you call them? Horror supernatural writers like Stephen King, Peter Straub.
I like Stephen King a lot. I think he's a very talented writer, very underrated writer. He's so big that people just sort of, take pot shots at him. He's really tremendously talented. I gave up reading him finally because his books began to disappoint me. just the plots, what would happen in them and so forth. But I really love Salem's Lot, and I love Firestarter. I thought Firestarter was the best book by him that I ever read. His great gift, I think, is to create a kind of what I would call an American proletarian horror. And it's exactly the kind of thing that I don't want to do. I like trying to evoke and revivify a sort of European, romantic kind of horror. I see in New Orleans the setting for novels that have the atmosphere of the European writers. Stephen King's a master of just exactly the opposite thing. Another thing I really want to do in my writing is create great characters, characters that live for me beyond the novel and beyond the limits of any one story. And he does exactly the opposite. He creates novels where there are no real heroes or heroines that transcend the work. And so he leaves me ultimately, I think, a little unsatisfied. But I have great admiration for him, and I think that he has done something to bring respect to the genre that really had never been done before. It was very hard to get supernatural work published in America before Stephen King. He's actually popularized it with booksellers. And the prejudices of booksellers in the book world have a great deal to do with what gets done. Peter Straub, I can't get through the books. They just get so tangled up. The writing is very wonderful, but the story gets so tangled up, I've never been able to finish one without just getting impatient and skipping major chunks. I really think he's just a heavily flawed writer, but it may be my failing. I'm a very slow reader. I haven't read very much of Clive Barker, just a couple of short stories, and I didn't really respond very strongly.
One of the nice things about the theater is that the writer has control. Have you ever considered writing for the theater?
I don't think I have the knack. I've discussed it a few times and been drawn into it. At one point, I was drawn into trying to do a musical with Tommy Tune, and we had meetings and I'm not sure why you're laughing, but in any event, we did try to do it, but I don't have the knack. I really, I think you have to be a natural playwright to write for the stage. You have to see things in that way, and I don't. I see a sort of continuous narrative going on backstage, So I can't seem to make it work. I also feel the climate in New York is very difficult, for getting something seriously done in the theater. Everyone there seems to complain about this, that it's very difficult to get something launched. So it's not a world I've wanted to venture into. I really consider novel writing the best, of all possible creative worlds for me.
Okay.
First, Ken, would you mind moving that picture just a little bit? My question is, I'm wondering what it's like to create these incredible, vivid Gothic characters and to live with them in the 20th century. What is it like to do that on a day-to-day basis?
The question is, what is it like to create these incredibly vivid Gothic characters and to live with them on a day-to-day basis?
Those characters are me, they are. I think that the kind of childhood I had here, the old-fashioned Catholic childhood on the edge of the Garden District, I grew up looking at America the way a foreigner would look at it. I mean, New Orleans is a much more American city now than it was 40 years ago or 35 years ago. It was really another country. It still is. It still is the third world, But it was really different then. And when I get into the skin of Lestat, 200 years old, I can really talk about the things about America that I see, because I do see it from a sort of displaced historical perspective. I've never really belonged in California. I was never really in step with my liberal friends. I was always saying, but what about what happened in the 19th century, the 18th century, or something like this, and I never have been, I felt at home as a contemporary American person. So I feel good with those Gothic characters, I see the world the way Louis and Lestat see it. I really do. It's very natural to me.
We can only have, unfortunately, one more question, because they'll let me go.
One of the things that I always remember from the books is the scene in Pride of Heaven where he's on his horse with his dog and he's attacked by the wolves. I don't remember the name.
Oh, that's from The Vampire Lestat.
No, is it really?
Yeah. Unless I forgot.
Could you talk a little bit about Pride of Heaven and the research and stuff like that?
Shall I repeat that? Yeah.
Yeah.
What talk a little bit about Cry to Heaven in the research? Well, Cry to Heaven is the only novel I've written that was totally set outside New Orleans or outside this country. It's 18th century Italy, and it concerns the castrati, these boys that were castrated at a very young age to preserve their soprano voices, and they would become like the superstars of Europe when they grew up, if they had magnificent voices. This was, again, it's just like the Free People of Color. I stumbled over a historic description of these boys and what happened to them, and the conservatories in 18th century Naples where they were educated, and the kind of fame that they could achieve. And I saw, again, this dramatic situation of an outsider who's right in the middle of life. Like, imagine, you know, leaving the opera stage with people screaming bravo and throwing roses at you, and women and men both sending, you know, their valets to tell you to come to this palazzo or that palazzo. And there you are, a castrated male. I mean, you are technically a monster, you know, and you cannot legally marry, which they couldn't. I was so intrigued by that I just had to get into that. I exhausted the research. I read everything I could on 18th century Italy, on the opera, and on the castrati, everything that was translated into English. And the involvement was just as intense as anything else I've ever written. That novel, in retrospect, feels more alien to me than anything else I've ever done. I entered into that world, and I went right back out of it. And I've never revisited it mentally. It's strange, and I think I've actually forgotten more of that novel than any. I know the wolves aren't in it, though they are in it.